What a strange world we live in. All right, I'm going to put this in the thread of the other one now. So we're actually live on that one.
Oh, we are?
Well, we're live on the new one, but there's no audience.
Right, okay. Okay, we're on. Just wait for some people to arrive.
Okay.
You can close that account password dialog. Welcome to Plan B, folks. This is the Retro Suburbia Book Club. This is just your opening act. My name's Charlie McGee, and I'm going to start with a little rap for you. I believe we all came to be here for a reason, to acknowledge the seniors. Everything has a season. This season is warm, but it's bringing a storm and a burning urge for our journey to transform. But held in our hand at this grave intersection is a map of the passage for a clearer direction. To a permanent culture, it's time we began it with some wise design to realign with the planet, share skills to rebuild our combined reliance, and with wild guidance, redesign our diet, befriend energy descent and the changing climate to grow forests of food and a finer environment. Permaculture at this tumultuous juncture is a superstructure that can plug the puncture in our society of anxiety, confusion, and greed. This really may be one solution we need to bring back our elementary essence of ethics. What can earth care, people care, fair share epic. Now's the time to embed it while the temperature's tepid. Let us rise as a choir beside the people who get it, to guarantee that our future generations' lives are provided the conditions they require to thrive, instead of being deprived of the tools to survive in a biosphere too defiled to revive. So we invite you now to amplify the synergy, inspire and devise a distinctive soliloquy, combining with like minds an adaptable symphony, and balance and symmetry. Whatever your ability, we need your assistance to aid in reclaiming a stable existence. Go summon your gifts as this critical hour and deliver wherever they move and empower. Thanks, guys. That's my new single from Formidable Vegetable called Climate Movement. We just released a clip with Brenna Quinlan's illustrations, kind of call to action for all you retro suburban permaculturists out there to get out and do exactly what you're doing, bringing the change we need to see. I'll post a link below in the chat, and Austie, maybe you can stick it on the YouTube for us if you want to have a look and check it out. Be my guest. But right now, we're going to hand over to the moment you've all been waiting for, our host, Austie.
I got to unmute. Hello, everyone, and welcome. And I hope you're actually, I hope this is streaming to the YouTube channel. I have no idea. Welcome to the Melbourne Retro Suburbia Book Club, formerly the Brunswick Retro Suburbia Book Club before COVID-19. Thanks for joining us tonight. In a little while, we'll have David answering a Q&A, but I might hand over now to Marty for a little bit for the acknowledgement of country. Marty.
Yeah, thanks, Austie. Just want to acknowledge the country that we're living on, the Wurundjeri, the Kulin Nations, and very grateful to be living here during these times, and like to welcome other houseies that I'm very grateful to be living with. And yeah, pass it to Sylvia.
Hello everyone, I'm Sylvia and I met Osti at the presentation of RetroSuburbia in Pachamama, in last year, 2019, in January. And he put a call out to start a book club, and my partner Mari already bought a book the year before, so, and I was like, reading here and there, and I thought, well, I really want to discuss those ideas with people. Like, there is no point just to read a book. That's a manual that needs to be used. And then I realized, well, let's gather some friends and people and discuss idea. And I think it's beautiful to see that everybody's gathering, and I use this space to share, connect, but also to take action. So yeah, and one of the first members was also Hannes, together with his partner Ting. So Hannes, if you want to talk more about the setup of the book club.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks for that, Sylvia. So I think it was about a bit over a year ago that the book club actually started, the humble beginnings. I remember I was actually at your old place, and so the idea was to meet fortnightly and read and prepare chapters of the RetroSuburbia book, and yeah, discuss this in a sort of very casual, organic, and friendly way. And alongside that was the idea to have a potluck dinner. So we basically would bring a plate to share, from ingredients that were sourced locally, organically, and often also grown by ourselves. So that was a really nice addition to discussing the book, obviously. So then also we would rotate the book club. So every 2 weeks, somebody else would host it. And yeah, this is a really nice thing that continued, I guess, towards the end of last year. Actually, we went into a bit of a hiatus, with people traveling and moving and going overseas for a little bit. So when we then convened again to resume the book club, COVID happened, and that changed a lot, as we know, for everybody. So it was basically everything is virtual. We had 2 meetings now via Zoom, and it appears that this is going on for a bit more time. So we don't know about the rules, obviously, around gatherings and social distancing and all that stuff, but we'll definitely keep these meetings going, discussing chapters from the book and talk about ideas and concepts. And I think, believe we extended it a little bit, and also to make it more welcoming for other people, we'll prepare a little 3-minute video documentation. I think that's scheduled for the next time, to show how we implement permaculture ideas and concepts in our own environments, basically where we live. And it's also great to see. So one of the positive things is that after we went virtual for quite some time, there were a lot more new faces. So that's quite encouraging, and it will be very, very interesting to see where we go from there. So I believe I can also share a little bit of the highlights that I experienced throughout this journey. So I'd say that one of my highlights from this whole time was actually would have been pretty much the first meeting, really. So that's chapter number 3, which is on page 53. So where and how we live. So what we did, we basically discussed the ideas about how we live, and where we would how we spend our time, right, and money and resources. So for me it was a really good point, a good starting point of self-reflection, which is, I find, very, very valuable, not just in these permaculture environments, but in general. So I remember that as a really good starting point, as I said, for to establish a baseline and then go from there. So yeah, that would have been my highlight. And I believe back to Marty or Jasmine. I'm not exactly sure at the moment, but whoever's next, like to hear. Thanks.
Thanks, Hannes. Yeah, I think Marty, do you want to discuss it? Just talk about any of your highlights or any of the chapters we've looked at and what you've got from it?
I'll go over to just me.
Okay. Howie?
Oh, it's our turn. So I'm one of the latecomers to the group. I wasn't there for the iteration, so I haven't got to meet a lot of these people face to face, which is really disappointing because they're so lovely. But so far, we've looked at some really interesting chapters of the book and things that are really relevant to the current landscape we're living in with isolation. And one of the first chapters we looked at was chapter 25, Changing Habits for Self-Reliance and Resilience. There was a lot in there about people being addicted to commuting, which I really resonated with, and the potential psychological stress that could be put on people when they're placed into a scenario like we find ourselves in now. So all these things that were really applicable. And it was talking a lot about identifying those potentially harmful habits and trying to break them. And then from that, opening up all these opportunities to work from home and what kind of progress that could bring to you in being able to do more around the house, being able to chat to your neighbors, building communities, going for walks, all these things that all of a sudden, we find ourselves doing more and more because of the current situation. We're all here in this chapter. It's quite amazing. That chapter talks a lot about establishing roles to people's strengths and their interests as well, which is something I really resonate with, and the ability to multitask and being agile and adaptive in the tasks you're doing around the home. I think we can all, if you are someone that's working from home, you could probably appreciate that you've gone from being in an office environment where your tasks are very focused to being at home where you might get up every 20 minutes to do something around the house. It's all kind of connected in that way. And the other chapter where we looked at was chapter 27, which is creating your own livelihood. One of the key points from that chapter that I really resonated with was that it's not just about earning money, it's about spending less. It's about doing more for ourselves and ensuring that our needs are met, and reducing costs instead of spending more. I think that was something I really resonated with, where we're starting to learn in this ISO environment that with people like myself who come from an office job to now working from home, that there's potential for maybe I could downscale things. I could keep working from home, and the kind of opportunities that brings is really exciting. That leads to spending more time at home can lead to greater enthusiasm for the stuff you're doing at home. You can become more engaged in projects, and especially in regards to things like gardening and trying to make your life sustainable. You can, when you're actually here and you get to see the progress that's happening, you get a real enthusiasm for it. And I've really appreciated that in the last couple of weeks. It's been really good. Now, I don't want to ramble on too much. That's just a little microcosm of the couple of chapters we've looked at so far. And I think it's time for a song. Yeah, I think it's song time.
Thanks. Good job for another song, Charlie, before we go into the Q&A part.
Nice. We just have a bit of a cameo from David Holmgren here. If you're lucky, you might dance. So yeah, this one's kind of based around the I guess, right livelihood chapter, or the home-based livelihood and alternative economics part of the book. But I wrote it long before the book came out. It's from the album Permaculture, a Rhymer's Manual, based on David's previous book, Principles and Pathways. And this one's about the principle of obtaining a yield, which I think is ringing truer every day. Well, if you work all day from 9 to 5 and come home feeling half alive and never see your kids and wife, then I've got news for you. There's no point doing what you do unless it's somehow good for you. You've got to get a result or two in the form of something real. Now, if you're feeling stressed and not the best and have trouble finding happiness, well, here's one thing I will suggest. Obtain yourself a yield. Obtain yourself a yield. Sustain your energy. Don't drain yourself. Maintain yourself. Obtain yourself a yield. Now, money is not the only yield. Yes, you could be making a bigger deal about what you eat for your next meal. You can't run on an empty tank. Ignore the stash of cash in your pocket. Just make a salad with some homegrown rocket. You just have to go out the back and pluck it. No need to go to the bank. You got to work your days for stuff that pays, in not just money, but in many ways. It's time you cleared away the haze and obtain yourself a yield. Obtain yourself a yield of something you can eat. There you can produce some things of use with your own 2 hands and feet. Obtain yourself a yield right in the here and now. Make sure to earn something in return. Here, let me show you how. Well, if you're feeling sleepy, then go and have a sleep. But if you feel like there's not enough air, then breathe in very deep. And if you're thirsty, then you ought to get yourself a drink of water. And if it's gonna be cold and you're feeling bold, I don't know, shear yourself a sheep. Cause in any given moment, there's everything you need. Just look around, it will be found, and obtain yourself a yield. Well, obtain yourself a yield, but take only what you need. Cause while it's pretty fun when you're getting somewhere, there's no need for greed. Obtain yourself a yield, and one for others too. Make sure to seal both ends of the deal of what's good for both of you. Well, an easy way to do it is to give stuff to your friends, because the good things you do come back to you, and the yield just never ends. That's right, the good things you do come back to you, and the yield just never ends. Well, the good things you do come back to you, and the yield just never, ever, ever, ever ends. Thanks, folks. If you want to have a listen, head to formidablevegetable.com. But I'm going to hand over now to the author of RetroSuburbia, co-originator of permaculture, David Holmgren, in the hot seat. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, Charlie. I was always going to say to you, that song actually incorporates at the end a bit of integrate rather than segregate, as well as obtain a yield, as a sort of a critique of.
Well, funny, you know how hard it is writing songs to your principles, David, because they all intersect, and pretty much every song is about the entire book. So thanks for being such a spherical thinker. Right.
Okay. It says Austin was going to introduce me.
I think Charlie already did it, Dave.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we might start to head into some questions. I might just say to anyone who's watching from here, this is a little bit of a different book club format, obviously, because David isn't usually with us in the book club, and we're usually not televising out to a larger world. But I think Diana had a question to ask.
Yeah, maybe I could say just a few things. It's really interesting, the whole idea of book clubs. As we got the book out in early 2018, there was a lot of people interested in that way of digesting something that's so expansive as well. And it was really interesting to see some of the reactions and interest that came from that. And I had heard a little bit about, from Osti about this particular book club, but I haven't been actually involved in any of the book clubs directly in this sort of way. So this is a first, and obviously a lot of things we're doing at the moment are firsts, and that's really exploratory exploratory. And so it's great to connect with you folks who've been in this group for a while, and also, of course, all the people who've recently joined it, and the sense of dipping into different places in the book and different chapters resonating. So yeah, I saw the list of questions. Yeah, happy to respond to those. So was it Diana who was?
It's me, Diana.
Diana, sorry.
Yeah, that's all good. It's so great to have you here, David. Thanks so much for taking the time to connect with us. I really appreciate it. It's really inspiring. So do I read out my question? Is that what I do? Yeah. Okay. So what is the potential for urban farming, which I think we know that there is a great potential? How do we lobby and activate for this to happen? And as well as that, amongst my friends, there's a really strong desire for us to get out and connect with farmers who have unused land in that peri-urban area, and for young, new, ethical farmers to be a part of a regenerative agriculture and fair food movement. Within that, I don't think that there's a lot of support and networks, and so I'm just wondering whether you know of anything, and how do we, you know, lobby and activate and create these networks? Do we have to do it ourselves, or is there stuff existing for us to help us?
Yeah, I think obviously there's been a huge increase in, especially the last decade, in young people again becoming interested in agriculture, and a lot of that is focused on horticulture, small scale intensive farming, and within a context of both resilience and coming out of the just experience of being more people being home food producers and seeing that they have a passion for it and wanting to scale up into that space of being commercial growers. Obviously in RetroSuburbia, we didn't sort of focus a lot on that because it's focused so much on the household and community non-monetary economies, which is sort of like the nursery or breeding ground for all these things that can, of course, scale up into the commercial. In the chapter Beyond the Boundaries, looked a little bit at those opportunities for use of the huge amounts of public space that there are, and identified the strategic opportunity in the sort of more recently built suburbs since the 1990s, where there's often actually very little space in backyards, but there's often a huge amount of public space, which is, you know, it's not exactly sort of heritage value parklands. It's often just a bit of mown grass and some gum trees and shrubs. So that potential is there, but of course the issue of access to that land and navigating all the stakeholders and all of those processes, I suppose over recent decades, groups doing that for community gardens and city farms, although there's been a bit of a sort of a learning cycle where local government is sort of used to, oh yeah, we have community gardens, or yeah, we can actually allocate land to people who are going to be commercial producers. A little bit more resistance there because that whole thing of, you know, privatizing the commons, and, you know, sometimes there's this sense of somehow is that sort of giving too much to some person. So I think there's still quite a lot of impediments there, but what we're seeing everywhere, like all of these related innovations, they start by people just doing it and developing relationships often with the private owners of land, and that really identifying who those owners are. And of course, the larger parcels of land in urban areas and at the peri-urban fringe tend to be businesses or developers who, you know, might sort of have some land on a very long-term notion of developing it. You know, factories and warehouses that have land for possible expansion. But if we step back, right back and say, okay, a lot of the people who are looking at doing this are actually coming from maybe actually a background in garden farming, very small scale, and wanting to scale up. And some of the opportunities are really the most obvious ones of people with large backyards who are not using those. And there's actually an example in the book, in one of the early chapters, the where and how we live with some chooks in the backyard was the property, but there was another one of an aerial view of the big McMansion and then the house next door. And it's a guy down in Geelong who was just talking to this old woman living alone, not using her backyard. And he was looking for space to expand for his micro enterprise. Gosh and Watts. Yeah, he's one of the early case studies on the RetroSuburbia website. So there are networks, I know in Britain, there's very active networks of garden sharing where owners who may have been gardeners, they're no longer gardeners, or owners who've just got a big space that's just mown grass, and that opportunity to sort of build those sorts of relationships. So those sorts of ones are the lowest impediment, and they allow a lot of people to do the sort of toe in the water of, is this for me, you know, what's actually involved. And similarly for a lot of owners, it's a low risk thing. So I think, I'm not sure whether anyone has done that here yet, but I'm sure some of the people in the network, it'd be interesting to ask people like Kat Lavers in Northcote whether she knows of those sort of networks. And then beyond that, I think there's, you know, that possibility of scale up. The other thing I see is the informal use that might become agricultural, but maybe not through the pathway of horticultural and cropping, but through grazing animal services. And we talked about that quite a bit in RetroSuburbia, and there are the beginnings of those as commercial services for vegetation management, that it's just fee for service for controlling blackberries and other weeds and along creeks and waterways, so much better environmental values. But those sorts of potential micro enterprises could morph, especially as we move into a more contractory economy, where there's a sort of an animal product sideline to that. So there's service, vegetation management service fees, but there's also maybe, you know, selling off the young offspring, or maybe even informal dairy. So I see that as emerging in a sort of like a grey economy, you know, a pathway through which grazing animals could then become a part of a lot of those public open spaces. Because if we actually look at them, you know, some of the public open spaces on nice alluvial flats are obviously got a lot of potential for horticulture, but, you know, a lot of other land is sort of pretty rough and it grows some grass and trees, or, you know, but isn't necessarily prime horticultural land. So, yeah, I think getting the working examples from direct relationship with owners is a really important precursor to authorities saying, oh yeah, that's a good thing. What sort of guidelines do we need to allow more of that? Because at the moment, there's a big threshold of a lot of work that's got to be done to get through those impediments that are there, unless you've got some, you know, very special, you know, council strategy that's specifically saying we really want to make this happen.
Great, thank you so much.
Oh, there was one thing I'd add to that. There's also the sort of unused industrial land and spaces, even buildings that have, you know, potential for aquaponics in intensive horticulture. And a lot of those things we didn't elaborate a great deal in RetroSuburbia either, because they're sort of more the city brownfields industrial landscape retrofit possibilities. And there's certainly things that could happen in some of those spaces from at least a regulatory point of view, or at least a social license point of view, where things could happen that might be seen as a bit noxious to happen in a residential area, you know, like a composting operation or something that involves machinery and a bit more noise or something. But again, things that can make use of building space, like with mushroom production or something like that. Again, getting connection to the owners of those properties and building those relationships.
Got it. So yeah, do it yourself kind of. Thanks.
So yeah, who's the next question?
I don't think Marcus is here, so it's over to Jack here, I think.
Yeah.
Hey David, thanks for joining us.
Hey.
So my questions relate to in Australia, we've got increasingly the land prices are out of control, and we're seeing that land ownership is increasingly kind of concentrated, and we're seeing more and more people in the rental market. And one of the side effects of that is that more and more people are living in a more transient way. So they're spending less time connected to the one place and moving around more. Something that I think about in regards to that is, how do we help people cultivate a sense of care for land and care for community when they feel like they don't have ownership or an investment in it, in what we would traditionally say is investment? Like, how can we help cultivate those values with people who are feeling, you know, pretty disillusioned and discouraged by the way that society is going more generally?
Yeah, well, I suppose there's sort of different levels in that. There's how much the issue of ownership to title is a necessary psychological or practical precursor to energizing and empowering people to do stuff and have that connection. And there's also the whole thing of connection to place, in the sense of neighborhood, locality, or at least bioregion, where people feel this is my country where I belong or feel strongly connected. But sometimes those things don't necessarily connect. I suppose over the many years of, you know, advising people doing the back to the land thing, you know, find people would sometimes buy a piece of land and, you know, fall in love with that piece of land, and then discover, oh, what sort of community am I in? Where am I? But it's also possible to work the other way around, of sort of like, you know, start at the high level, you know, looking over the country, you know, like, where do I want to land, or where do I feel at home? What is my territory? And then sort of coming down into that, which we talked about in the first chapter of the behavioural, which I forget all the chapter numbers, the ownership and living arrangements, which is really the, like, each of the chapters at the start of each of the fields. It's sort of the large overview and all of the different strategies, the extended family, household, shared ownership, renters in a preferred area. That strategy of, okay, I want to be in this area, start making connections in that, even if my particular tenure in the place I'm in is limited or insecure, what are my network connections in that area? And through that, building a sense of knowing what's going on, what are opportunities, and that includes being able to come across housing that might not actually come onto the rental market. Includes the ability to say, okay, well, I'm going to connect into this community garden or this school project in this area and invest some effort because I know I've got this commitment to this area. And even if I'm not in this particular house, then that doesn't mean I've lost all those other connections. That's also fits in with the strategy of holding what resources one's has for the property bubble to unravel. And of course, I know I've been saying this for a long time, but I think, you know, I truly believe that there's limits to how much they can keep massively stimulating this bubble is of unprecedented proportions. It really dates from the early 1980s, and we know all of these bubbles do unravel. So at the moment, people are actually understanding that and grasping the idea, which is completely foreign to 3 generations of Australians, that a landlord is actually taking the risk that the property is going to decline in value. Whereas where we're so used to people just earning this unearned income from capital gain of property just goes up in value. So although the actual access to land and resources, there's this huge natural resentment of how ridiculously expensive, it's also, I believe, this resentment that somehow people who own are just getting this benefit, and how unfair that is. Well, that will turn, and it turns the tables very rapidly. I believe this pandemic is actually it. And I was hearing one of the top economists in the country interviewed on Radio National, and he was talking about, yes, the next thing is what will actually happen to the property market, and it's a longer, slower thing, but there is sort of huge stresses in that. One of the aspects that's showing up from COVID, of course, is it smashed the illusion that everyone has to commute. So what that's going to do is increase the hours of use on average of housing where people live as more people work from home. But it's going to mean there's going to be this huge amount of commercial real estate that has no tenants. And so shops and all sorts of buildings are going to actually come onto the rental market for people to live in. And I think we really are going to see that idea that we don't have enough housing, we don't have enough buildings, is just going to be completely blitzed away. And I think that will also start to open up the greater recognition by owners that the only value in a building is its use value, and having someone do something productive in that space is actually a benefit. So people who are capable and have the energy and interest in doing that start to become the assets that owners of property actually need. You know, so I think there are a lot of these ways in which this, you know, tables could turn. The other thing I'd just say, when I was young, a lot of people used to say to me, you know, why do you do all this work on other people's property that you don't own? And I'd say, well, you know, I get to use their property, their tool, their capital to do things, maybe based on the fact that they thought I was sort of useful and competent. But the skills that I take away from that, no one can take that from me. That's mine. And that gain from that, opportunities to learn, free opportunities to learn, I think are a sort of a huge part of that equation. But yeah, we'll have to see over the next few years how those sort of relationships change. So I don't know whether that sort of answered your question.
It does, yeah. It's interesting. There's definitely things there that I just haven't thought about. Yeah, it's really.
Go on.
I suppose that leads into another question that I've been given the okay to ask you. Comes from a friend who's currently tuning in via YouTube, and he lives full time in his van and is kind of entering into the Permi journey, and that whole idea that I think a lot of people have at the start, and I know I definitely did, was that permaculture is about gardening, and he knows that that's not the case, but living full-time in a van is a very different way of living than a lot of society. And so he's wondering, how can he incorporate permaculture principles more into his life when it is so transient?
Yeah. Well, of course, he probably fits into potentially that household form and location that's also connected to the renters in preferred areas. Who else did we have in there? We had in the squatters, you know, the more radical ones, but the network nomads, the people who are on the move, who have that great advantage of being able to go to where some opportunities are, or where good weather is, and, you know, move away from where bad stuff's happening, or, you know, that sort of partially seasonal migration. Of course, we always associated that with either the privilege of grey nomads or the homeless, you know, people in tough circumstances. You know, sort of two quite different groups that, you know, are mobile. And in the pandemic, a lot of those of both groups have found they needed to park somewhere, you know, and connect to some sort of space or maybe some other household. And that's exactly what we saw the opportunities in RetroSuburbia. There's a synergy between the people who are in their established properties and the network nomads who might visit for a period and have a sort of a regular contribution to some larger place, but are not necessarily there for the long term. So having a series of good campsites, temporary housing within or beyond a sort of a home buyer region, and staying long enough to contribute to gain an invite for a return visit. So sort of like actually really scheduling those relationships with people. So you're adding value into a place, and that building credits and relationships, because those sort of become the backup systems for what's inherently, you know, can be a sort of a fairly vulnerable, you know, existence. Like on the practical side, there's, I think we mentioned the idea of, you know, solar dryers on vehicles, you know, in summer traveling along, drying fruit on the roof, but even things like making yogurt, you know, making sprouts, different ferments, and of course, getting to know, being a sort of an expert forager of knowing where in your particular region, where are the public fruit trees and different things. And even, you know, being able to have, especially for sort of rural campsites, like a little drum stove, so you're not totally dependent on just bottled gas, and, you know, you can stop and make use of free fuel. So a lot of those sort of opportunities. The other one, of course, is just maintenance, because your vehicle is your home. That whole thing of being competent at maintaining that and keeping that in good working order is really critical to your well-being and your financial position. But it's also like one of the universal valuable skills. You know, as we say, permaculture is not just about growing food, but about all of the self-reliance things.
Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, who's next question?
Hi, David.
Hello.
It's a good segue talking about that permaculture was more than growing veggies. Nice segue into my question. I've been watching a lot of businesses around me transform their purpose from being cafes into veggie hubs and all of these alternative services, places that are switching from places, I don't know, the way where they were, say, like a rock climbing gym, are thinking about what other services they can provide to respond to the times. And it got me thinking about what RetroSuburbia, what the businesses look like on Aussie Street. You know, the ones that are, for the people that aren't yet creating their own livelihood and aren't moving into, say, food production or like animal husbandry. How can we bring Aussie Street into business practice? And I was wondering if you've seen any businesses that have maybe you know, retrofitted their services to be more aligned with permaculture.
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, there's lots of ones that have done that over a long period of time. But I think there's, you know, this crisis is making more people think about that. And I think part of the understanding, of course, is the recognition that a huge amount of the economy is actually discretionary expenditure. It's not actually necessary. And that's been one of the main themes that I've talked about, that when you get contractory economies from the normal sources like, you know, normal recession and depression as a result of property bubble collapse and all the things that are sort of inevitable anyway, then you move back to sort of what I sort of dually called a spuds beer and petrol economy. You know, mentioning the beer to sort of indicate that, you know, it's not just a hard needs, but also critical addictions, if you like, and that that a huge amount of small business is actually not concerned with those sorts of things at all. So, you know, I've talked about how the number of coffee shops and gymnasia and dog shampoo services, all of these things that, you know, if you're in that sort of economy, then you must expect it to sort of go down radically in hard times. Whereas the basics are often being controlled in our economy by corporations, because the margins of return, like on food selling, for example, are so low that, you know, the supermarkets dominate in that sort of area. But what we've seen happen is small businesses that are at the creative edge of the alternative food supply system, community supported agriculture, and in our area, a community supported bakery, that those micro businesses have had this huge boost in customers. Customers wanting to get closer to the source, customers not wanting to stand in queues in the supermarket. So our local one, Twofold community supported bakery, was like ticking over in a house, commercial kitchen fitted into a residential house with, I think they had 23 subscribers, and they weren't necessarily selling out each Sunday market in Daylesford. And they're now at 140 subscribers, and they sell out every Sunday with what they can produce. Now, the funny thing is that everyone we know in our communities seems to be suddenly doing sourdough baking bread at home. So obviously, it would seem to me a lot of the people who might have been customers of that subscription system are actually now doing it themselves. So they must have got a lot more customers coming across from Baker's Disgust and Moles and Bullies, you know, as their customers. You know, now obviously, you know, that hasn't sort of led to Moles being closed down in Daylesford for lack of customers. You know, there's all sorts of incredible changes that are sort of happening, but I think there is that opportunity for more people wanting to connect to something real and genuine. And also, I think the pandemic has had the effect of people suddenly going, no, my health is actually really important, and sort of maybe shifting their habits. In terms of businesses that have evolved organically along the lines of, if you like, the residential pattern of Aussie Street. Obviously in Aussie Street, Ollie was the urban farmer in the backyard scale. And of course there was Gareth with his obtaining engineering in a big workshop. You know, and we probably didn't mention it that Ian, the uni lecturer, was actually doing online teaching from home. So, you know, those sorts of things. If I think of Richard Telford, the graphic designer of RetroSuburbia and permaculture colleague for a long time, and his place in Seymour, Abdullah House. So he's worked from home as a graphic designer from a country town, and managing a lot of our publications. We're effectively working online between us. You know, we only see each other every few months. And then gradually there was a stepping stone where he and our son, Oliver Holmgren, formed Permaculture Principles as a book distribution and retailing company. And that started in terms of the base in a shed, a retrofitted shed in the backyard of Richard's mother's place in Seymour. And in fact, once that got scaled up, there's now, of course, their employer, Christine, who's the person who actually is packaging up and sending out RetroSuburbia books. And there's further retrofitting happening in that sort of backyard situation. So that sort of organic stepping stone growth in often a sort of a residential context is a sort of a really good example how the business emerges out of one's passions and one's skills, and using what resources and then building those up in steps rather than the conventional small business thing of we write a business plan, we go to the bank and get a loan, and then we run like mad and hope that we're one of the survivors in small business rather than the majority that fail. The other example, of course, going back to the urban farming, Curtis Stone, whose book on urban farming has become a bit of the sort of manual on this sort of thing, super rational, evidence-based, intensive production in very small spaces, and has found that actually access to land is completely not a problem at all. It's actually the skill set and the ability to sort of produce product direct to customers. For his model, it's sort of mostly been restaurants. But again, in a contracting economy, that would have to be morphed back into, boxes direct to residents. When partly that happens because literally fewer people are going to restaurants buying food, meals, but more food is being consumed at home in a household economy. So there's that sort of shift that way. And of course, Hibby Farm, the folks who are on the cover of RetroSuburbia, there's 2 part-time livelihoods from workshops in the backyard, a pottery workshop and a bicycle manufacturing workshop. So I think those are some of the examples that come to mind for me. But the more we can find of those, of course, are all part of that. There was also one of the examples in RetroSuburbia, and it's at the end of chapter 24, the photograph of the retrofit of the former t-shirt factory that became the Join the Dots workshop artist studio in Marrickville, Sydney. We had the good fortune when we were in Sydney of staying with those folks, and that, so we didn't again talk about those sorts of things so much in RetroSuburbia, because again it sort of more relates to sort of commercial landscapes and commercial development. But that hybrid between, okay, this is actually a workshop, a studio space, but it's actually also an informal residence space. And I've seen a number of those over the years where sometimes there's a small factory and it's got a bathroom, it's got a bit of a kitchen, because it was, workers had lunches and there was showering facilities. And then that's become a series of sort of artist studio spaces, but actually people are also sort of living in that. So it's a hybrid between the residential and the business, which is, of course, so many people in the past lived like that, and it was efficient. The blacksmiths living above their workshop, the shop, and the residents, because they had efficiencies of doing things together, but sometimes having that a bit separated. One of the opportunities that I think I identified when we were doing the research on RetroSuburbia, and most of it was really focusing on the sort of suburbs that I grew up in the 50s, and realizing that a huge amount of them have had the backyards filled in, and then all the suburbs built since the 1990s have these huge houses and hardly any growing space. And of course, the great symbol of consumption, the double, and of course, often even the triple fronted garages. And then I realized these are the perfect spaces for sort of workshops or putting your wares out on the forecourt, having the big area to work on, working in the public domain, and then at the end of the day, bring all your stuff in, close down the roller door. So this movement of people back into residential areas and the becoming commercial spaces, these workshop opportunities, was a different type of opportunity than, oh, we've got a big backyard that we can grow food in.
Thanks, Dave. I thought I might just jump in there for the next question, just for anyone who isn't aware of Aussie Street, or what we know when we say Aussie Street. There is a a chapter in the book, chapter 2, Aussie Street, the Past and Future of Suburbia, on page 35, which well, in that actually, David, you predicted the Great Depression of 2020. So it's worth a read for anyone who's got the book. And if you don't have the book, you can access that online.
I think I actually said in the property bubble started to unravel in 2018. Of course, they did a whole lot more stimulus stuff and it sort of popped back up again. But I did say as Australia slides into the second Great Depression of the 2020s, life in Aussie Street is humming, not always sweetly, but nevertheless it's humming. So there's, of course, the version of me presenting that is closer in my mind because I've done it so often, but writing it down for the book was quite an experience because I'd been telling this story for years, almost decades. And when I started to write it, it was like I was sort of this, one of those oracles where you're in a trance and you're sort of, it's just coming out. I realized all these different relationships between the people in the street. And I had to sort of, oh, this thing's alive, you know, it's sort of growing by itself. And I do enjoy that exploration, that other way of talking about these things, especially when we're talking about stuff, both in the past, but in the future, that through storytelling allows us to grapple with also some of the more challenging things and see how they might be navigated rather than them just being sort of very source of fear or denial.
Yeah, and I should add there for anyone who wants to hear David's Aussie Street presentation, that is on the YouTube channel. I'll paste those links into the chat as well. You can hear the full presentation.
For a lot of years, there was some earlier versions which weren't so good, but it's not a bad presentation. I did that at Morwell last year as part of our tour around the country, and I think there were 250 people there, and it was, you know, it was working class Latrobe Valley audience actually, you know, for a lot of it, and it was a great sense of people interested in these things across an increasingly wide social spectrum. But yeah, let's have the next question.
Hi, Dave, that's me.
G'day.
I've been reading the last section of the book quite a bit, the behavioural chapters, and I've been thinking about how during lockdown and before as well, a lot of my friends were expressing interest in starting gardens and growing food of their own, but they didn't necessarily have the skills to make any like significant dent in their household food spend. And I just wanted to know from your experience, like what training resources do you think are fundamental for people that want to kind of start this journey and start building some self-resilience?
Yeah, well, obviously in RetroSuburbia, I distilled down some sort of learned lessons over many decades of food growing at the home scale. And in that, I also gently sort of unpicked some even, you know, permaculture ideology, you know, the balance between tree systems and vegetable production, especially with limited space, and how, you know, the prioritizing of vegetables as part of a diet, and obviously the immediacy of what can be achieved there. And also explored some of the different sort of frameworks or styles of gardening, from the sort of natural wild through to the sort of bio-intensive, and sort of just trying to give people a sense of a macro view of because there is a huge range of information that people could access, and there's all different angles on things. And of course, with the internet also, there's things where you know, you can look at information and you need to ask that question, where is that person? What climate are they in? What soil are they on? How does it relate to me? Because a lot of the behavioral stuff in RetroSuburbia is pretty applicable right across the whole swathe of certainly the Anglo-American world, and even just generally middle-class countries where people live in suburbs. Our colleagues in Brazil, you know, desperately want to translate the book. And I said, God, how does it, you know, connect to there? But, you know, there is a lot of those issues are fairly universal, whereas often how we grow food is very particular to sort of climate and soil and context and scale. So we tried to provide that sort of information, but obviously we can't do, okay, this is also a manual for how to sort of make really good potting mix and raise seedlings, and which types of vegetables should you raise as seedlings and which ones should you put in the ground, and let alone, you know, how do you deal with slugs and snails? Or, so I think I'm not sort of like, in some ways, the best person to ask on that, but I know that the Milkwood Permaculture Living course, in spite of it having an overview of permaculture, has been remarkably good at allowing people to address those like really immediate concerns. I want to skill up in doing exactly this. And there's always in that course a strong proportion of people who want to know how to produce more food effectively, you know, food at home. I think the person who I would ask about that more than anyone is Kat Lavers in Northcote. And there's reason for that, apart from her being, you know, one of the case studies in the book. In fact, in the biological field, her place is the case study. And of course, she's kept records of what she's managed to produce. So she's very good on the science and the whole issue of a lot of people start gardening, but a lot of people stop gardening. And her passion is about how to enable people to do it better, to be more effective home producers. Now, part of her job is that in Hobson's Bay Council with their My Smart Garden program, which I think at one stage years ago, I hope she won't mind me saying, when I asked her what it was, she said, oh, well, it's sort of like permaculture for dummies. Well, you know, or it's solving problems of like, how do I, you know, what's wrong with my compost? You know, like, why is it not working? Or, you know, and actually addressing out to a wider audience of people, you know, the actual sort of best methods to do certain things. And I know she's sort of working on resources at that level. And I think that is very important, because I think she's right that a lot of people at various stages in life and also in various waves and cycles in society start food gardening, and it can be a bit complex, especially, you know, like if you're not getting the really fantastic rewards from that. But of course, there's also case studies in the book. It was interesting, Matt and Sabah, who also measured what they produced and were just working on a rental property. And, you know, two people without kids, both with backgrounds in sustainability, but not really having been food producers before, and just going into it, researching it all, mineral balancing, rebalancing their soil, and doing, you know, getting extraordinary yields of food that they were then trading with people in the area who had fruit trees, which they didn't have. So they were just producing so much in the way of, you know, tomatoes and vegetables. So I think, yeah, that can be different for for different people. Of course, the great thing is also just to sort of tee up with someone who is an experienced gardener and go and help them. And even, you know, some old cranky, you know, gardener who sort of might even be using some pesticides that you think, you know, there's no way I'm going to do that. You know, there's a huge amount to learn from people who are just being competently gardening, especially if they're doing it in an area that's the sort of same soil type or whatever that that you're on. I suppose the last one in that I'd mention is the whole process of permablitz, which has sort of started in Melbourne years ago, of course. And although a lot of those projects tend to be, okay, we're going to establish a garden here, which is sort of slightly different to how do we actually develop the techniques of cyclical production. And I think that's been sort of maybe some of the weaknesses in sort of permaculture. There's been a great focus on that. Okay, let's, you know, get the area all planted and starting a new garden. And of course, the classic sheet mulching technique of quickly getting something happening. But what does that garden look like years down the track? Because the methods for maintenance of productivity may be quite different to, you know, how you start off. So I think, of course, one of the businesses that also came out of the permablitz process was that Dan Palmer and Adam Grubb started was Very Edible Gardens. And I think that business consultancy certainly in terms of helping people get started often with owners on a patch, but also through their courses and other information. You know, their website is really useful, a lot of that stuff. So hopefully there's a few pointers there. Of course, local permaculture groups, you know, often there'll be people who are, you know, got an enormous amount of knowledge in a particular area, and sort of helping those people. We've seen increasingly on the RetroSuburbia Facebook page this huge exchange of information, of course, of people asking about different stuff. And of course, as that grows, it's like, wait a minute, where are you? What climate are you in? And we're hoping over time there'll be more capacity to have our sort of like resident experts, if you like, to sort of answer questions there too, if that capacity builds up.
Thanks so much, Dave. I think I did have one more question, but I'm going to hand over to Hannes because I know he's really keen to ask you a question as well.
Yep.
All right. Hi again. So I'd just like to extend on the point that that you touched on before, actually, I think. So for people in a renting situation or people living in smaller apartments or units that don't necessarily have the space outdoors to grow or produce their own food, who might even have just shaded outdoor areas, it might be quite hard for them to produce any meaningful produce there. So what are the strategies that you can think of or would recommend to include, I think you called it a communal land, like green strips, reserves, parklands, all these spaces, in order to foster more social, I guess, interaction and also communal food production. So if you could elaborate on this, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the most obvious ones in that area is that interface with the private and the public space of the nature strip, that strip of public land, which is, you know, normalized as being somehow the responsibility of the householder, the residents of that place to sort of maintain or look after. You know, and it may be just a strip of grass, it may have a tree. And sometimes those spaces don't have much potential for food production because there's a whopping great big evergreen tree there, or but often where they're grass, people have turned those into verge gardens, and sometimes those gardens have been where people didn't have sun access on their place, or their place was actually very small. And it's interesting that verge gardens in various forms have sort of emerged spontaneously very strongly in Western Australia, and they didn't come about because people asked for permission to do it, even though they were very different from what was the social norm of sort of just grass and trees. But I think that in a lot of ways there's a good argument that is a public space. It actually doesn't as much suit something delicate like vegetables, because it's subject to sort of traffic and compaction and kids playing ball games in the street, if not cars coming up on the verge. So sometimes those spaces are not ideal for that, and they're more ideal for robust fruiting trees, or trees like olives, sort of one of my favourites in the regard of those spaces. So I suppose in terms of serious vegetable production from gardens that are inherently delicate, don't handle the wind, don't handle people bashing into them, let alone kids playing ball games or dogs, the backyard or front yard space of someone's place nearby, who building that relationship, I think there's so much value in that. But it's a matter of surveying that. Of course, these days we can actually just look on Google Earth and look at all the backyards, around the streets near us and say, gee, that place looks prospective. And of course, I mentioned an example of that decades ago, a permaculture guy I knew in Sydney who was a remote sensing expert for geological sensing, and he was wanting to buy somewhere in the northern suburbs of Sydney, but he wanted to be on the Ashfield shale clay soils, which are actually relatively uncommon because the Hawkesbury sandstone stuff in Sydney is pretty harsh and poor. But he wanted to back onto a creek, and he wanted a north-facing house, and he had all these criteria. And anyway, he just looked and got the geology map and overlaid it with the street map in the areas that he was interested in, and then walked down a series of streets and looked at the houses that he thought were interesting, and letterboxed about 100 places, and got, I think, a dozen or so replies, and bought a house through that process. So I think to some extent it's possible to sort of look about and see that those sort of relationships too. Where's the prospective ground? Oh, now who are these people? Could I chat up someone, see whether there's any possibilities? And given that there's so many places in suburbia, finding that right sort of people who might be interested in that relationship. But obviously we have a little bit of a sort of a property share network that Meg Ullman has set up here for people looking for rental places, and people who are looking to wanting people who will garden, but to do it in ways where it's not necessarily that's the place you're living in. You're just sort of using that space. I think those sorts of possibilities are so great. The other thing, of course, is community gardens. The reason community garden pattern with allotments evolved in Britain and Europe made a lot of sense, where you've got higher density buildings, and especially in cool, cloudy climates where the space next to buildings is actually got so lacking in sunlight. So to have a sort of a small field within walking distance of apartments and all the gardens are sort of there together actually made a lot of sense. But as we move, like in Australia, for example, up the East Coast and into the subtropics, where light is not so much of a limiting factor and where sort of food forest type gardens are, a more important and valuable part of food growing systems than they are in cool temperate climates, then you can find that a lot of those spaces near buildings actually work quite well. And the latest addition to the case studies on RetroSuburbia, Gav's eco flats, and they're renters who became co-owners in a block of 1970s flats, and they now do the food forest garden around the flats. It's obviously multiple owners, a very different sort of example of RetroSuburbia. But just recognizing that, yeah, those, as you move into different climates, these sort of different issues become limiting. But definitely in the cooler parts of Victoria and Tassie, that light access to gardens is often like a really critical limiting factor. And a lot of our vegetables are selected to, even if they like a cool climate, to actually have full sun. Of course, if you're then growing them in really hot weather, sometimes you need some sort of partial shading to sort of cut down the heat. But in light terms, trying to grow things like lettuces in partial shade, they don't, a lot of them, those vegetables don't really grow so well. Hope that's.
Thank you. Thanks, David. Cheers.
Welcome.
I think I'm next.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sylvia. So my question was related to the chapters, the behavioral one, because I think it's related to COVID and how we're changing our habits at the moment. So the chapter 27, 25. So you're talking about the different types of livelihood, and I was kind of trying to think. Of course, I think it's very personal, but which one do you think is more successful or resilient in this time, that we are with the lockdown, and, could be that we are easing up, but could be a long time until we go back to old habits. And also which one is sustainable after COVID. So the one that we can resilience now, but also sustainable after. So which type of livelihood?
Yeah.
And as well, if I can add, like which steps can we take collectively? Because now we are growing awareness. So instead of acting as individual, acting as a collective instead.
Yeah, well, in that last part of the question first, often when people think about the individual and the collective, they think, yes, that isolated individual that, the consumer capitalist system encourages us to be as a completely sort of apparently autonomous, but actually completely dependent on the system. And then when people think about the social, they think at all sorts of scales, from national to sort of union organisations to corporations to sports teams to local neighbourhood community, all of which are sort of maybe, people are embedded in and related to, but everyone is actually also a member of a household. And that weakness of the household has been so highlighted by the pandemic and the isolation in that period. And I think people's experience that has been very positive out of that is often related to how rich and diverse with possibilities their household situation is. Because the household is always the backup to livelihood. Now, of course, community is that as well. That's part of the social insurance system, and whether that's relatives, neighbours, networks, and all sorts of support structures. But those historically were always built on a foundation of strong households. Now, it's hard for households to be strong when they're just composed of two, let alone one person. Inevitably, that means more of what you do and relate to is at that larger level. So I think that's why I've sort of focused on what I think is that sort of missing middle between community and the individual. I think that generates livelihoods in many, many different ways, because when there is quite a lot of people sharing, and especially if that is in some long-term, more stable sense, whether that's shared ownership structure or whether it's extended family household, you can get some degree of roles and specialization and some opportunities for people to be able to invest in taking something which is a passion into it actually being a livelihood that can bring money into the household. Because that stepping up process, that organic growth from I'm really passionate about this, I really like doing this, I like doing it for myself, for ourselves, for the household, could that actually become a livelihood? I think that sort of question about, okay, what am I really good at? And that thing I mentioned before about some of those things, people doing that over the last 30 years, what they've done is inevitably been, if not in the luxury end of the economy, it's in the discretionary side of the economy. Because there's always been sort of opportunities for that growth. But if we can see how that can hedge by being more focused on what are sort of more essential things. And the big example I mentioned before that mentioned quite a lot in RetroSuburbia is people who can fix things. That as you get into a contractory economy, the throwaway mentality sort of starts to become devalued just in practical terms. And one of the things that is the precursor to that is the awareness where people start resenting the throwaway. And so things like repair cafes have been a fantastic way of building that capacity, and people who have those skills wanting to give them to others. But then what comes out of that is a smaller number of people, and often young people, even children, find, oh no, this is actually, I'm really interested in this, and I can develop a skill level which is so far above other people that people will pay me to do that. And in a sense, that's what happened. One of the things our son Oliver Holmgren did when he was a teenager, he got so good at fixing computers that it actually emerged into a livelihood, and his first business was that, which he continued to do for a long time, actually. So those skills of, okay, where are people really dependent? I mean, the other obvious one I mentioned before is being a mechanic, and probably both a bicycle mechanic and car mechanics, that people needing those skills. So what those things sort of illustrate is livelihoods where you can trade with another person, where you don't need the intermediation of a government department or a corporation. Whereas a lot of people's current skills have highly trained people, but they can only work in a large structure. And without that structure, even their enormous skill, they can't sort of go to someone, look, I can do this thing for you, because that person can't value what that is. I mean, I used the example in RetroSuburbia of a mechanical engineer who might have a hobby of vintage cars and a beautifully set up workshop, and gets laid off, and he might find he can turn that hobby into actually being a sort of competent mechanic.
Is this a dissertation or an answer to a question?
Well, I'm going to take that as the chance to just jump in and say, talking about that local economy, I've got all the Holmgren sitting in my lounge room, social distancing at the moment, fixing my computer.
Oh, so, not seriously.
Yeah.
Fixing your computer. How did you persuade him to do that?
It wasn't, I had to twist his arm. I told him you were going to be on the screen here.
Of course, there is a photo over Oliver's shoulder in the book to illustrate fixes in the livelihoods chapter, with two Mac laptops open and looking at things that I found my eyesight couldn't even see. I think he was about 16 at the time. I can't remember when I took that photo. So he's still at it in a way, but doesn't do it for a living now.
Takes a bit of arm twisting. Dave, I'm aware that we are over time, but if you've got a couple more minutes, I might ask a question from one of the people in the YouTube thread. We might skip over my oil question for now.
Come back to
this
that.
one's from Peter, and he says there's been an influx of people interested in permaculture. Do you think people will make the shift and take on permaculture as a way of life? Or do you think sort of, over the coming months, they're just going to revert back to their past habits once we go back into the normal?
Yeah, I think the fact that the pandemic has been incredibly mild here inevitably will mean there is compared with some other countries, there might be a relatively faster recovery in the economy, and a lot of people might go back or try to go back to normal. But I think what they'll find is that it's actually sort of not doing that it's not actually normal at all, and there'll be other waves even without a second wave of the pandemic. The sort of changes I suggested in relation to commercial real estate and the whole building industry in Australia. So circumstances, people will continue to find new things arising that will be challenging their ability to go back to normal. Though I think the vast majority of people will do that, attempt to do that, and they might have experienced the isolation or at home, homeschooling kids as, oh God, I never want to do that again. But I think there's people with, as the question suggests, people who are attracted to permaculture and took this as a sort of a push. There's a fair chance that those people, some sort of spell is broken in their behaviours, whether that's in relation to commuting, whether it's in relation to, I know people going, maybe home education from the kids is actually something I might investigate more, or yes, I am going to prioritise the garden, the seasonal garden. I've been wanting to do that for ages and I've made a start. So in lots of different ways, I think people will keep connected to that. If somehow, the economy sort of goes back to what the government would hope, and consumption rockets back up and whatever, and somehow it magically goes back to that, inevitably over time, there would be a drift back towards that, because the massive lure, the massive encouragement to consume now. Your social responsibility is to consume, to, you know, get the economy working. I don't think that's going to happen this time round. So I think some of the greater challenges will be, do people find the information, the social reinforcement from others that are saying, yeah, what you're doing is good, and are they getting the rewards from that that actually encourage them on that pathway? But it's a little bit a tendency for a social divide where some people who can get back to work go, oh yes, I don't want to have to actually think about any of those things at home again. I don't want to have to cook another meal. I'll go out to the restaurant. I think those increasingly more people will find over time that life is not just not satisfying, but more and more difficult to maintain.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And thank you for coming tonight to answer our questions. Really appreciate it.
That's good. Sorry, I didn't get to your question about the extraordinary oil price, but maybe it's unwise to ask me that after what Sue said about a dissertation.
Yeah. Maybe we can do it as a separate Q&A, just that single question.
Yeah, just that. Yeah, a mad world where you actually have to pay to take oil off someone's hands.
Maybe I'll get a written answer and we can put that in the thread for people to be able to read. But we'll see how we go. But yeah, thanks so much again, Dave, for coming here tonight. Is Charlie still around, or is he headed back down?
He is.
Hey,
Thank you, David.
thank you. I didn't officially introduce you before, Charlie, but everyone, this is Charlie McGee from Formidable Vegetable. And
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Thanks,
Thank you, Charlie, for
thank you,
joining us.
Yeah, good to be in lockdown with you.
I'll put some for anyone watching on the YouTube thread. I will put some links to the book club group on Facebook, also to some of the other things that were discussed tonight. Yeah, we hope to see you in a book club or a gathering once social restrictions ease a little. And here's to RetroSuburbia.
And don't forget, if you're watching the YouTube stream, remember to like the video and share it with as many people as possible, because we're trying to build the RetroSuburbia YouTube channel. And we've also streamed this on the new RetroSuburbia Instagram. So, you know, if you want to follow all the social things and share and help us build this in that digital abstract world that is also out there, then that would be really helpful.
And Charlie speaking there in his capacity as our RetroSuburbia social media new maestro.
Yeah, dude. What a dude. You're going to play us out with a song, Charlie?
Oh, yeah. Which one? No, that's a silly one. I'll play the permaculture ethics one. How's that? This is Earth People Fair. I wanted to find a way to explain what permaculture was to people in, 1 minute or less. So I figured a song was probably the best way to try and do that. Want to see myself as a part of the whole. Grow some food for my family food bowl. Stand my ground but give up control. Know the boundaries but tear down all the walls. Won't give up or give in to apathy. Gonna plant a tree, then plant another 3,000. Now's the time to start feeding my soul. Feeding the soil, believing anything is possible. As I get older, some things become clearer. The end of my life is always getting nearer. focusing on the things that bring meaning, food, community, love, and healing. Getting tired of all this moving around. Want to bring it back home to a simple piece of ground. Been talking about it till my mouth is dumb, but all I want to do is make a deeper connection with some Earth People Fair. Let me hear it for the Earth People Fair. Well, I've been looking for my Earth People Fair. Yeah, 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 yeah. A stray alien wandering this ancient land. So much of the dream that I still don't understand. Been looking at you, but I'd rather see you and follow the path of that old dark emu. Someday my body's gonna breathe its last. Yeah, I'm aware that this too shall pass. But till then, I'll keep singing to the open air, hoping there's time to advance. Earth People Fair, Earth People Fair. Hey, yeah. Let me hear it for the Earth People Fair. Well, show me where to find the Earth People Fair. Yeah, 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 yeah. Thanks, guys. Cheers. What's up for Dave? David Holmgren in the house. Check out more music at Formidable Vegetable whatever. Yeah, thanks heaps, folks. And please, if you get a chance to share the new video we've just put out, it's a great call to action for the Permies of the world and beyond. So yeah, get amongst it. Keep doing the amazing work you're doing. And thanks, Osti, for hosting.
Thanks,
Well,
Osti.
thanks to the whole group for hosting. And yeah, remember everyone watching the video, if you can do the like, as Charlie said, and we'll see you all around. And Book Club peeps, I'll see you next Thursday week.
Yay!
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.